What's up everyone, it's Ozzy, and this is probably my most requested Ryzen 3 video, and that is the comparison between the R3 and the old FX series lineup. Now the question here today is not whether or not you should buy an FX CPU instead of a Ryzen 3 chip, because you shouldn't buy an FX CPU at all today. The AM3 Plus and AM3 socket is dead, and the FX chips are way behind their Intel counterparts and now the Ryzen series CPUs. Instead, this is for those who are already using an FX series CPU and they want to know whether or not the Ryzen 3 series is a worthy upgrade. So let's find that out. So the R3 1200 is a 65-watt quad-core processor without SMT. The 1200 is clocked at 3.1 gigahertz with a 3.4 boost. It has 2 megabytes of L2 cache and 8 megabytes of L3 cache. It's based on AMD's new Zen core and it is priced at $109. The FX 8370 is a Vishera CPU based on the pile driver architecture that's derived from Bulldozer. It is a 125-watt 8-core processor without SMT, and it is clocked at 4.0 base with a 4.3 boost. It has 8 megabytes of L2 cache and 8 megabytes of L3 cache. So if you have watched my previous Ryzen 3 videos, then you already know the RAM setup, but basically at stock, the Ryzen 3 is going to be running 16 gigabytes of DDR4 at 2667 and 3200 megahertz of 16 gigabytes of DDR4 once the R3 is overclocked. And again, my reasoning behind this is if you are in the market for a Ryzen 3 CPU, then you're probably in the market for an A320 motherboard, and that supports memory clocked at 2667 without any kind of overclocking to the memory. If you're overclocking your Ryzen 3 CPU, then you need a B350 motherboard, and that supports as fast RAM as you can handle. Now, because of time restraints and because I did not have a proper aftermarket cooler, the FX 8370 is going to be running at stock with 16 gigabytes of DDR3 memory clocked at 1600 megahertz. Now, when DDR3 memory was more mainstream than DDR4 memory, 1600 megahertz was pretty standard, but you can definitely overclock your RAM to get a little bit more performance. Unfortunately, I did not have the time to do that, but I know a lot of you probably do have both your FX chip and your RAM overclocked. So just keep in mind that that can give you anywhere between 5 to 15% more performance on average. Now, like I already mentioned, I did not overclock the FX chip because of time and because I did not have a proper cooler, but I did overclock this guy. I got it to 3.8 gigahertz at 1.37 volts. And like I've mentioned in my previous video, if you've overclocked one Ryzen chip, you've basically overclocked them all. They all hit a wall around 4.0 gigahertz, and don't expect any more than 3.8 to 3.9 at the max with any kind of stock cooler. So the R3 at 3.8 gigahertz ran a bit hotter than the 8370 at 4.0 gigahertz, but their stock coolers are also very different, so the comparison isn't the most fair. Nonetheless, I thought I would show you the results anyway. Also, keep in mind that my ambient temperature is kind of high, 83 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 28.3 degrees Celsius. Now, the final test benches of each will be shown on screen, and I'm using the Galaxy GTX 1060 Exotic Sniper as my video card, and that's for two reasons, like I mentioned in my previous video. One, it's the fastest video card that I had readily available at the moment, and two, I think it's a pretty fair GPU to pair with both of these CPUs, as you probably won't be going any higher than that. But nonetheless, in order to rid any GPU bottleneck, or to rid as much GPU bottleneck as possible, I benchmarked the games at both 720p and 1080p. But before we go into the gaming benchmarks, let's look at the CPU benchmarks. In the Cinebench R15 multi-threaded benchmark, the 8370 beats the 1200 at stock and when overclocked, but that's kind of expected. It has double the cores and threads compared to the 1200. Still, the scores are much closer than you'd expect. Only a 10% difference between the overclocked 1200 and the stock 8370. And in the single-threaded benchmark, there's absolutely no contest. The 1200 blows the 8370 out of the water, as most of you probably expected, as it has less IPC, and that was really the FX series' Achilles heel. In Blender 2.78c, I used AMD's Ryzen demo that's available for download on their own website. The R3 1200 ties with the 8370 despite having a 900 megahertz lower base clock and demolishes the FX chip once overclocked, a 23% increase over the 8370. In Dolphin, a GameCube and original Wii emulator, the 1200 beat the FX chip by over 30% once overclocked. And it's not that much of a shocker because Dolphin, again, is really IPC and single-threaded application based, but cores do help, as I found out in my R3 1200 and R5 1400 comparison. In Handbrake, I converted a 1-minute 1080p video to another 1080p video using the H.265 video compression standard standard, the R3 falls behind the 8370 at stock but makes up for the lost time once it is overclocked. In Vegas Pro 13, I rendered the same clip that I used in Handbrake, but I added a ton of effects, and I used the standard Internet HD 1080p preset, but I upped the FPS to 60 instead of the standard 30. The trend continues with the R3 at stock taking the same amount of time as the FX and then taking the lead once the R3 is overclocked. So based on my benchmarks, the R3 1200 and the FX 8370 have about the same multi-core performance at stock when it comes to real-world applications and not just benchmarks, and the R3 wins in single-threaded applications. Once you overclock the R3 though, it takes the definite win over the stock 8370. Alright, so now for gaming benchmarks. Like I mentioned earlier, I am using a GTX 1060, and although that will cause a GPU bottleneck at 1080p, I also have 720p benchmarks for your convenience so you can really see how the CPU performs in all of the games tested. The games I tested are not the most benchmark friendly, if that makes sense, but they are the most popular games today, and I thought that would be a more realistic approach to this type of video. So without any further ado, here are the gaming benchmarks. If we look at the 7-game average at 720p, the R3 1200 is the definite winner here at both stock and when it's overclocked. There's almost a 50% increase in performance between the R3 1200 at 3.8 GHz and the FX 8370 at stock on average, and there is a huge jump in 1% lows indicating much smoother gameplay. If we look at the 7-game average at 1080p, the numbers are much closer together, and this indicates a GPU bottleneck. Still, the R3 1200 is about 13% faster than the FX 8370 at stock, and that increases to around 20 to 25% once the R3 is overclocked to 3.8 GHz. If we look at the 1% lows, there is also a big disparity between the R3 1200 and the 8370, both at stock and overclocked. Now, I won't have any price to performance graphs on this video like I usually do in my R3 comparison videos, and that's because you're not going to be buying this CPU new. And if you are considering it, please stop considering it, because you should not buy the CPU brand new. Now, the Ryzen 3 1200 could be a worthwhile upgrade for you, or it could just be more of a side grade for you, depending on what you're doing and what FX chip you have, and then if you've overclocked the FX chip at all. But I think my recommendation can boil down to these 3 points, and I think if you meet these 3 points, then it could be a good upgrade for you. 1, if you play a lot of Overwatch, a lot of Battlefield 1, or a lot of CSGO at a high refresh rate, if you plan to overclock the R3 1200 and use higher speed memory, and if you plan to sell your FX series platform and then pay for at least half of the price it would take to upgrade to the R3 platform, then yeah, I think you should upgrade. Now, if you're on a lower end FX chip, such as the FX 4000 series, or if you're on the first iteration of the Bulldozer architecture, that includes the FX 8150, 8120, 6100, or the 4100, or any of those that end with a 100, then this could be a worthwhile upgrade for you, because you'll see a bigger disparity between the R3 and your CPU than the R3 and the FX 8370. With that being said, if you have the FX 8370, 8350, 8320, and you have it overclocked with some nice RAM, then I don't recommend going with the R3 series. Make the jump to the R5 series. Yeah, the R3 1200 will give you about 25% 1080p gaming performance clock for clock, and it will give you better performance in CPU applications, but you also got to remember that if you're going to go with the R3 1200 plus a B350 motherboard and 8GB of DDR4 memory, you'll be paying at least $225, and I don't think that constitutes a 25% upgrade. Besides that, the R3 is definitely an upgrade, but it's closer to a side grade than anything else. You won't see a huge performance boost, but it would definitely be noticeable. I will have a GPU bottleneck test for the R3 series coming up with a GTX 1070, and before you say anything, I got the 1070 after I started benchmarking, so I couldn't pop it in and use that as my main benchmarking GPU. But yeah, if you liked it, then leave a like, and if you loved it, subscribe, because I have more videos like this coming out in the near future. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Peace.